It was late, the office nearly empty, when she looked at me with eyes that carried both command and hesitation. The office always felt different at night. By day it buzzed with phones ringing, footsteps echoing down the corridors, and the constant shuffle of papers being passed across desks. But once the sun sank and most of the staff slipped out, silence took over. The hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic from the street below were the only reminders that the world still moved outside these walls. I sat at my desk, finishing the last touches on a report I had promised to deliver by morning. My shoulders ached, and I rubbed the back of my neck, wondering if I had stayed too long. But then I noticed I wasn't alone. She was still here. Her presence was quiet, steady. Ms. Harper, the company's senior secretary. She was the kind of woman who carried herself with natural grace, the sort that didn't need to announce itself. At 42, she had the kind of beauty that seemed sharper, more defined, because of time, not despite it. A streak of silver ran through her dark hair, pinned neatly back, and though her blouse was slightly unbuttoned at the collar from the long day, it didn't make her look undone. If anything, it made her look more human. She moved carefully, sliding files into her drawer, aligning papers on her desk as though tidiness was her way of putting the day to rest. I found myself watching her more than I should. Noticing small things, how her fingers lingered on the edge of a folder, as though her mind was elsewhere, how she paused at the cabinet and drew in a quiet breath before turning back. "Still here?" I asked softly, my voice breaking the hush of the room. She gave me a faint smile, one corner of her lips curving in that calm, self-possessed way she always had. "Looks like I'm not the only one." Her tone was light, but there was something underneath it, something that told me she hadn't stayed just because of unfinished work. Maybe she wouldn't admit it, and maybe I wouldn't either, but the air between us always seemed heavier when it was just the two of us. I closed my laptop slowly, more deliberate than necessary, as if to buy myself time. I figured I'd finish this tonight instead of letting it hang over me tomorrow. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she was really listening. Her eyes drifted toward the windows where the city lights blinked faintly through half-closed blinds. The glow cut soft lines across her face, and for a moment she looked more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. The office, usually sterile and impersonal, suddenly felt smaller. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it wasn't empty either. Every sound seemed magnified, the shuffle of her papers, the faint creak of the chair as I shifted, even the tick of the wall clock that counted the seconds a little too loudly. I realized then that being in the same room with her after hours carried a weight I couldn't quite name. I could sense her awareness of me, just as I was acutely aware of her. Maybe neither of us had meant to linger, but we had, and neither of us seemed ready to leave. "Would you like me to expand Part 2, Keynote 2, next into a full 550-word section, so you can see how the tension unfolds step by step?" You said, "Expand Keynote 1, 550 words, ChatGPT said, "Here's a fresh 550-word expansion of Keynote 1, After Hours, written as a full narration draft for your YouTube story, Part 1. After hours, the office felt like a different world once the day ended. The chatter, the ringing phones, the constant footsteps in the corridor, all of it had faded hours ago. What remained was silence, a heavy sort of stillness broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner and the low buzz of fluorescent lights. It wasn't eerie exactly. More like the building itself was tired, exhaling after a long day. I should have gone home by now. My report was finished, the emails all sent, yet something kept me in my chair. Or maybe it wasn't something. Maybe it was someone. Across the room, she was still working. Ms. Hartley, the senior secretary. She carried an air of calm authority, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. Even after 12 hours at her desk, she looked composed. Her blouse was neatly tucked, though one button at the top hung loose, as if she'd finally allowed herself a small breath of comfort. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pinned up, though a few strands had slipped free, brushing against her cheek. I watched her in stolen glances, careful not to linger too long. She was sorting files, moving with unhurried precision, the way someone does when they're not in a rush to leave. Every movement seemed deliberate, the slide of papers into a folder, the soft click of a drawer closing. For a moment, I wondered if she even realized how magnetic she was. Not in the loud, obvious way some people are, but in the quiet way that draws you in without permission. At 42, she seemed to carry her age like an advantage, not something to hide. There was elegance in her restraint, strength in the calm of her presence. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking too loudly in the silence. She glanced over, catching me off guard with eyes that seemed sharper in the dim light of the room. A small, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "Still here?" she asked. Her voice was soft, low, carrying that trace of authority I'd always noticed. It wasn't a question that demanded an answer, more an observation, a reminder that she noticed me just as much as I noticed her. "Guess I lost track of time," I replied, forcing a faint laugh. "And you?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Paperwork," she said simply, though her tone made it sound like an excuse more than a reason. Her gaze lingered a beat longer than it needed to, then drifted back to her desk. The city lights outside filtered through half-closed blinds, casting lines of silver across her face. In that glow, she looked softer, almost vulnerable, like the carefully drawn lines of her day had begun to blur. I realized then that neither of us had stayed behind by accident. She could have left hours ago, and so could I. Yet here we were, two people surrounded by silence, both pretending to be busy while the weight of something unspoken filled the air. The office, so ordinary during the day, now felt like a space suspended outside of time. And as the seconds ticked by, I couldn't shake the sense that something was about to shift between us. The office had grown dim, shadows stretching longer across the walls, broken only by the amber glow of the desk lamp between us. The city beyond the window pulsed with its own rhythm, car headlights flashing, a distant siren rising and fading, but inside this room, time seemed to hesitate. Ms. Hartley leaned against the edge of my desk, her fingertips tracing the polished surface in absent patterns. She wasn't rushing, and she wasn't pretending to be occupied anymore. There was a stillness in her body, as if she had gathered all her thoughts, and was deciding whether to release them. I sat back in my chair, trying to look calm, though inside my chest my heart drummed too loudly for me to ignore. The silence between us was no longer the ordinary kind. It was the kind that demanded to be broken. Finally, she exhaled, not a sigh of weariness, but the kind that carried weight. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in that look, I knew something had shifted. "There's a reason I asked you to stay a little longer tonight," she said softly. Her voice was even, but there was an undertone that betrayed her. Vulnerability. Hesitation. I swallowed, forcing myself not to lean too far forward. "I wondered," I said quietly. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. She crossed her arms across her chest, a gesture that looked protective more than confident. Then, as if realizing how it might seem, she let them fall to her sides again. "This is not easy for me," she admitted. "I've always prided myself on keeping boundaries clear, professional, neat. But lately," she paused, shaking her head lightly, as though the words themselves were difficult to arrange. "Lately it hasn't felt so simple." Her confession hung in the air, more fragile than I expected from her. She had always seemed so sure, so composed. To see her hesitate, to hear her voice falter, it made my chest tighten. "You don't have to explain," I said gently. "I think I understand." But she shook her head. "No. I need to say it. Because if I don't, it'll keep weighing on me." Her eyes locked with mine again, steady now, as though she'd found her courage in the moment of her own honesty. "I feel something I shouldn't," she whispered. "Something I've tried to reason away. You're younger and I'm me. People would see it as wrong. Maybe it is. But when it's just us, in moments like this, it doesn't feel wrong at all. It feels—" She stopped there, the word left unfinished, her breath catching. I hadn't moved, but every part of me wanted to. My hands pressed lightly against the edge of the desk, my chest tight with the urge to reach out and touch her hand, her shoulder, anything to let her know she wasn't standing in this alone. The silence returned, but now it was charged, every second stretched thin with what she had left unspoken. Her words had cracked open something between us, something fragile, uncertain, but undeniably real. And in that dimly lit office, I realized the locked door wasn't about secrecy anymore. It was about courage. The glow of the desk lamp seemed warmer now, though maybe it was just the closeness between us that made the air feel heavy. Ms. Hartley hadn't moved far from where she stood at the edge of my desk, her hand resting lightly on a stack of papers she no longer seemed to see. The city outside pulsed faintly through the blinds, streaks of light sliding across her face and then dissolving into shadow. I couldn't ignore the way the moment had shifted. She had confessed more than I ever expected her to, and now every breath, every glance, carried a new kind of weight. My own pulse thudded in my ears, too fast, too loud. She drew in a slow breath, then pushed gently away from the desk. For a second, I thought she was going to leave, that she'd take back her words, retreat into the safe distance of professionalism. But instead, she circled quietly to my side. Without asking, without explanation, she lowered herself onto the edge of my chair, close enough that her knee brushed lightly against mine. The leather creaked beneath the sudden shift of our weight. My chest tightened. I didn't move. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Her shoulder nearly touched mine, the warmth of her presence making the small chair feel impossibly crowded. I turned slightly toward her, and when I did, she let her hand fall, brushing against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. It could have been accidental. It should have been. But she didn't pull away. Neither did I. Her fingertips rested against my skin, featherlight, and in that touch was something far greater than its simplicity. My hand trembled, just barely, and she must have felt it because the corners of her lips lifted in the faintest, most fragile smile. "You're nervous," she said softly. Not as an accusation, but as though the idea almost comforted her. "Maybe," I admitted. My throat felt dry. "But not because I don't want this." The honesty startled me as much as it seemed to startle her. Her eyes searched mine, as though she needed to see the truth there before she allowed herself to believe it. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, her thumb grazed the side of my hand. A small gesture, simple, tender, but enough to send a current through me. I couldn't hold still anymore. I turned my hand, letting my fingers brush hers in return, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken was sealed. The office no longer felt like an office. It felt like a threshold, a space balanced between restraint and surrender. And though we hadn't moved closer than that single, trembling touch, it was enough to redraw the lines between us. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, and she lowered her gaze to our joined hands. "This shouldn't be happening," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," I said. "But it is." The words weren't bold. They weren't daring. They were simply true. And as her fingers lingered against mine, neither of us made any effort to change that truth. The office had fallen into a silence so thick it pressed on my ears. Outside, headlights swept across the blinds in brief flashes, breaking the darkness in fleeting streaks before vanishing again. Each band of light revealed her features, the curve of her cheek, the faint line of worry in her brow, the quiet strength in her eyes, before shadow reclaimed her. Her hand still rested against mine, her fingers gently curled, as though letting go would undo everything we had just allowed to surface. My chest rose and fell too quickly, each breath unsteady. I didn't dare move, but I couldn't look away either. Finally, she whispered, her voice low and trembling with a conflict I could feel in my own bones. "This feels wrong." The words cut through the silence, sharp but fragile, as if she wanted me to disagree, needed me to. Her hand shifted slightly against mine, almost pulling away, almost staying. I leaned forward, just enough for her to hear me clearly, my voice a murmur meant only for her. "So why does it feel right?" She drew in a sudden breath, as though the question itself unraveled something inside her. Her eyes lifted to mine, searching, caught between reason and longing. I could see the storm she carried, duty pulling her back, desire pulling her closer. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, her hand slid more firmly into mine, her thumb brushing lightly along the line of my wrist. The touch was delicate, almost cautious, yet it sent a shiver through me so strong I felt it in my spine. "I've told myself 100 reasons why this can't happen," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost pleading with herself. "I've reminded myself of the years between us, of what people would think if they knew. But sitting here, with you, all those reasons feel smaller. Weaker." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "And what do you feel instead?" Her breath trembled as she let it out. "Want. Fear. Both at once." The honesty in her tone nearly undid me. I wanted to close the space between us, to pull her into my arms, but I forced myself to stay still, to give her the chance to lead the moment. She looked away briefly, her gaze landing on the locked office door, the faint outline of its frame visible in the dim light. Then, almost as if the sight steadied her, she turned back to me. Her free hand rose, slow, hesitant, until her fingers brushed against the cuff of my sleeve. She lingered there, not quite holding on, but not letting go either. The warmth of her touch bled through the thin fabric, and I knew she was silently asking the same question I had: how much further can we let this go? The answer wasn't in words. It was in the way her body angled ever so slightly toward mine, the way her hand refused to leave my wrist, the way her eyes, though filled with hesitation, refused to look anywhere but at me. In that moment, desire wasn't reckless. It was weighty, heavy with consequence, but also undeniable. And though we both felt its danger, neither of us pulled away. The silence between us had grown into something fragile, like glass stretched thin, waiting for the slightest movement to shatter it. Her hand still lingered on my wrist, her thumb grazing the edge of my pulse in soft, absent circles. The touch was light, almost hesitant, yet it tethered me to her more firmly than any words could. She exhaled, the sound uneven, and her shoulders softened as though the weight of her own thoughts had become too heavy to carry alone. Then, without a word, she shifted closer. The space that had held all our restraint vanished. She leaned into me slowly, carefully, not like someone reckless, but like someone surrendering after too long of holding back. Her forehead came to rest against my shoulder, her cheek brushing lightly against the fabric of my shirt. I froze, breath caught in my throat, afraid that any sudden move might break the spell. Her closeness was overwhelming. The faint scent of her perfume, warm, floral, and softened by the day, drifted up as I breathed her in. The heat of her body radiated through the small distance left between us. For the first time, I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, faint but insistent, pressed against my side. Almost without thinking, my arm lifted and wrapped around her waist. The movement was instinct, not decision, and yet it felt like the most deliberate choice I had ever made. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned in deeper, her body softening against mine as though she had been waiting for this permission. "I shouldn't," she whispered, her words muffled against my shirt. "But it feels like I can finally breathe." I closed my eyes, resting my chin lightly against the crown of her head. "Then don't stop," I murmured. The room felt smaller, wrapped around just the two of us, as though the rest of the world had slipped away. The locked door, the dim light, the hum of the city outside, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the warmth of her body pressed against mine, the way her fingers gripped lightly at my sleeve as though to steady herself. I could feel the tension leaving her, melting into the embrace, as if she had finally allowed herself to set down the armor she carried every day. She wasn't the composed, untouchable secretary now. She was simply a woman who had allowed herself to trust someone enough to lean into him. I didn't speak again. I didn't need to. My hand brushed slowly along her back, not to pull her closer but to remind her she was safe here. With me. Her breathing slowed, syncing with mine, and in that quiet rhythm, I knew something had changed. This wasn't recklessness. This wasn't a moment stolen carelessly in the dark. This was a choice, fragile but certain, one made not out of impulse, but out of trust. And as she rested against me, her presence steady and warm, I understood that this was not the beginning of a secret, but the beginning of something real. The world outside the office hadn't stopped, cars still rushed through the streets below, horns echoed faintly, and neon lights pulsed against the glass. But in here, time felt suspended. She was still in my arms, her head resting gently against my chest. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, no longer hurried, no longer uncertain. Each rise and fall seemed to settle deeper into me, like we had both finally stopped running from something we hadn't dared to name. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, tucking it gently behind her ear. The small gesture made her lift her gaze, her eyes meeting mine in the dim glow of the desk lamp. There was a softness there I hadn't seen before, as if her guard had been lowered for the first time. "This isn't simple," she whispered. Her voice was steady now, but quieter, like she wasn't speaking to convince me or herself, only to admit the truth aloud. "It could be complicated. People will talk. They always do." I nodded slowly, my hand still resting at the curve of her waist. "I know." Her eyes searched mine, waiting for hesitation, waiting for me to retreat. Instead, I held her gaze, letting the silence answer for me before I spoke. "But I don't care about what they say. I care about what's real when it's just us. And this." I gave a slight squeeze, enough to remind her she was still in my arms. "This feels real." Her lips parted, a faint breath escaping as if my words had touched a part of her she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She leaned her forehead briefly against mine, her skin warm, her presence grounding. For a moment neither of us moved. We simply breathed the same air, shared the same closeness, allowed ourselves to exist without explanation. Then she smiled, not the polite, composed smile she gave in meetings, not the faint, cautious one she wore around the office. This was softer, freer, the kind of smile that came from choosing honesty over fear. "I don't want to pretend anymore," she said finally. The words were quiet but firm, carrying the weight of a decision she had wrestled with for too long. A warmth spread through my chest at her confession. I cupped her cheek gently, my thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. "Neither do I," I whispered. She leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before opening again, clear and certain. Whatever doubts remained hadn't disappeared, but they no longer controlled her. What remained was trust. We stayed like that, not rushing, not speaking, just holding each other in the dim light of the office. Outside, the city roared on, but inside, there was only quiet certainty. The locked door was no longer about secrecy. It was about creating a space where we could be honest, even if just for these few hours. And as her head came to rest against my chest once more, I knew with unwavering clarity, this was no longer a fragile moment balanced on hesitation. This was a choice, one we had both made, and one we would carry forward together. 8.